You're 33 years old. Last Sunday, Emre stood in your kitchen holding an unopened beer and asked if he could crash on your couch for a few weeks. Can I stay for a few weeks? Of course, we'll figure it out. 11 years ago, you and Emre graduated in the same month, applied to the same companies, and started your first real jobs 3 floors apart in the same building. He got promoted first. He got the corner small office first. At the graduation reunion, everyone said Emre was the one who was going to make it. Last Sunday, he asked to sleep on your couch and you said yes before he finished the sentence. The difference between you was never talent and it was never salary. The difference was something you started doing at 23. Something very small and very boring, something no one who saw you doing it thought carried any meaning. You did it quietly every single week for 10 years and never mentioned it out loud. This is the story of how you disappeared from a race everyone is still running and how no one noticed you were gone long after it was over. Rewind. You're 23. You have your first apartment, a job with a badge and parking, and finally a bank account in your own name instead of your parents'. Every 2 weeks a number goes into that account and disappears again in about 11 days. Not because you're reckless. You pay rent, you buy groceries, you go out with people from work because that's what you do at 23. And each of those things feels completely reasonable in the moment. You never look at the total and think this is a problem. You just vaguely notice that the number never really grows. It just moves. In April, you get your first raise. $1,500 a month. For about 2 weeks you feel like you've made real progress, and then the raise quietly folds into slightly nicer grocery orders and a subscription you forgot you signed up for. And the feeling of progress disappears with it. Every year you work harder and somehow you stay in the same place. This pattern repeats itself so many times that you stop noticing it as a pattern. It just becomes what having a job feels like. No one ever sits you down and explains this part, so you have to learn it the hard way like most people do. Every time your income increases, your sense of what counts as normal quietly rises with it. The apartment that felt exciting at 22 starts to feel like something that probably needs upgrading at 24. The perfectly fine car starts to feel a little embarrassing next to what your coworkers drive. None of these individual decisions feel reckless. Each one on its own looks completely reasonable. Only when you step back and look at 5 years at once do you realize the pattern has a name, and the name is this: lifestyle creep quietly swallows every single raise before it has a chance to become anything else. Emre, meanwhile, is doing the thing that looks like winning. He leased the car that turns heads in the parking lot. He's the one suggesting the nicer restaurant. He's the one who always seems to be coming back from somewhere. People talk about Emre like he's someone who has it all figured out. You don't resent him. You just quietly assume he knows something you don't. It's worth stopping here because this is the part almost no one explains properly. At 23, you can't really understand the difference between someone who is financially strong and someone who is just financing their appearance well. The signals look identical from the outside. The car looks the same whether it's owned outright or comfortably 3 years into a lease you can't actually afford. The meals look the same whether they're funded by savings or by a credit card balance that gets a little worse every month. You spend a good chunk of your 20s assuming that visible spending is proof of invisible security, mostly because no one ever showed you what real security actually looks like, and real security, by nature, doesn't announce itself. When the turning point happens, it doesn't look like a turning point. It's an ordinary Tuesday. Your manager comes to your desk and says the quarter went well and a small bonus is coming, $5,000. You expect some kind of victory feeling. Instead, you feel almost nothing, and that absence bothers you more than a bad number would. That night, for the first time, you do different math. Not this month's math. Not this year's math. You do the math of your entire working life and you land on a number that freezes you. If nothing changes, you're going to spend roughly 40 more years doing exactly this. And at the end of it, there's no guarantee you'll have anything to show beyond exactly where you're standing right now. This thought doesn't panic you. It just sits there, heavy and quiet, 4 days. A few weeks later, you strike up a conversation with a guy in the break room you've been walking past for 2 years without really seeing. He's close to retirement, probably driving the same modest car he's had for a decade, and he never seems rushed or anxious. Half-jokingly you ask him how he's always so calm. He thinks for a second and says something you don't fully understand yet. There's a big difference between spending money to look good and actually being good. Most people never figure out which one they're chasing. Then he goes back to his coffee like he didn't just say something that would rearrange the next decade of your life. That night you sit down and actually tally up everything you have. The number is small and looking at it directly is a little embarrassing. But instead of closing the laptop and forgetting, you do something almost no one around you does. You decide that starting with your next paycheck, before rent, before anything fun, before anything else, a fixed amount will be transferred to a place you can't easily access. Not a big amount. Small enough that it barely leaves a trace on your lifestyle. You automate it so you don't have to make the decision again. Because if the decision is left to future you on some random Tuesday night, you already know future you will find a completely reasonable excuse to skip it. You're not trying to fix everything at once. You're not cutting out every small pleasure or turning your life into a spreadsheet overnight. Because you already suspect, correctly, that a plan that miserable won't survive past February. You just protect that fixed amount like it's a bill you already owe and you let the rest of your life stay mostly the same. Then you write a date on a sticky note, the date when, if you just keep doing this and let it compound for years, you would theoretically reach financial independence. You fold the note, put it in a drawer, and tell absolutely no one. You don't quit your job. You don't announce a new lifestyle. You just quietly start paying your future first and everyone around you continues to assume you're exactly where you've always been. On the surface, you are. 2 years pass. You're 25 now and something subtle has changed. It's hard to point to exactly what, but it has. You stopped chasing the promotion that would bring more hours and more stress. You stopped quoting your job title like it was supposed to impress anyone. At a friend's birthday dinner, the question makes its usual lap around the table. What are you up to these days? What's next for you? 2 people at the table have real answers, the loud ones. New title, new apartment. When it gets to you, you say things are stable, which is true and also says nothing. You watch the small polite thing faces do when the answer isn't exciting enough. The conversation moves on in about 4 seconds. On the drive home you notice a feeling that doesn't have a good name. It's not exactly jealousy and it's not really about money. It's closer to the feeling of quietly falling behind in a race everyone still seems to be running at full speed, a race you consciously decided not to run anymore on paper. For most of your adult life, your job title functioned as the answer to the question of who you were. You voluntarily gave up that answer and you don't yet have anything to replace it with. What you don't realize yet is this exact discomfort, the discomfort of deliberately not being impressive, is the hardest part of the whole process and you've already gotten through the worst of it without knowing. At 27, without either of you really discussing it, the dynamic between you and M. Ray quietly inverted. He pulled into the parking spot that Monday morning, right next to yours, looked at your modest sedan, and his expression wasn't smug, it was worried. You good, bro? Financially, I mean. You say you're good. He nods, the kind of nod people do when they don't quite believe you but don't want to push. At lunch that same week you overhear 2 co-workers talking about you, unaware you're within earshot. One says you must be sending most of your paycheck to family, that's the only explanation they can think of for why you never upgrade anything. You don't correct them. You really can't. Not without explaining the automatic transfers you've been making for a decade that no one asked about. So you eat your sandwich and let them believe the story that makes sense to them. Being underestimated, you're starting to notice, isn't a cost of the plan. It's basically the entire design of the plan. 29 is the hardest year and no one really prepares you for this part. You're doing everything right and it feels worse, not better. There's no applause for the number growing slowly in the background. Your closest friend is buying a house and sending photos with keys in his hand to the group chat. Dozens of people react within an hour. You write congratulations, delete it, and write it again, because you're genuinely happy for him and also quietly aware that you haven't matched that milestone yet and might not for a long time. That night you pull the sticky note out of the drawer again. The date on it still feels impossibly far away. 6 years of doing the responsible thing, and all you have to show for it is a folded note in a drawer and a number no one can be proud of in front of others. For the first time, an uninvited thought enters. Maybe they were right. Maybe you spent your best years on a scoreboard no one would ever see. That same year the market has a rough stretch and for a few months the number goes down instead of up. Somehow that feels worse than it just staying flat. You check it more often than you used to, it never helps, and you feel a little smaller every time you do. A part of you wants to stop the automatic transfers, just for a while, just until things stabilize, just long enough to feel like something is under control. You don't stop. At this point it's stubbornness more than confidence. It will take years to understand that this particular tension, the tension when the plan looks like it's failing, is actually the ordinary cost of something that takes longer than a year. At 31 everything gets tested at once. On a random Thursday a layoff wave sweeps through the company and by the afternoon half the floor is gone, including you and Emre. Standing in the parking lot with your cardboard box, you do the math again, this time fast, not out of curiosity but necessity. The fund you built is real, 8 years of small, boring transfers are sitting there. Not enough to live on forever but enough breathing room if you protect it instead of raiding it. So you make a decision that hurts in a very specific, very personal way. You move back in with your parents for a while, sleep in your childhood bedroom, and postpone the trip you had finally allowed yourself to plan. It's humiliating in a very specific, very personal way. The first night lying there, the date on the sticky note suddenly feels farther away than the day you wrote it, and for a moment you seriously question whether the whole plan is actually going to work. But you don't cash out to zero. You don't take on new debt to make the situation look better from the outside. You accept the temporary humiliation instead of borrowing against it. Emre handles the layoff differently. He keeps the apartment. He keeps the car. From the outside, for a long time, Emre looks like he's actually doing better than you, because he never has to move back home and never appears to be struggling in front of anyone. What you learn much later is this: he was quietly financing that image with a new job he was panicking about and a growing pile of debt no one could see from the parking lot. He wasn't ahead. He just looked ahead, and for a while that was enough to fool everyone, including himself. You eventually go back to work, but on your own timeline, because for the first time in your life you can afford to wait for the right offer instead of taking the first one because rent was due. After that things change gradually and less dramatically than you expected. A blown tire becomes an event instead of an emergency. A bad manager becomes a situation you can leave instead of one you're trapped in. Time stops feeling like something you're constantly running out of. The date on the sticky note eventually arrives on an entirely ordinary Tuesday and you almost miss it entirely. No one throws a party because no one else knows the date exists. You just look at your accounts that evening, quietly realize you crossed the line you drew for yourself a decade ago, and go make dinner like any other night.